Hello, my name is Just Like Possums, but Jay works just fine. Here on my channel, I talk about whatever I want, and today that just so happens to be a fake, real Persian mummy. So let's start talking about it. Now, what do I mean by a fake, real mummy? Well, the mummy is real. There is a real body that was mummified. However, it was not the body of a Persian princess. It was also not the body of an ancient person, but the body of a modern day person that seems to have died a violent death, which leads to a host of other questions, which I will in fact be asking. Now, quick introduction if you are not familiar with the Persian mummy, or the Persian princess as she's also known. It is the name given to an unidentified and mummified set of remains that belong to a Pakistani woman. It's surprisingly hard to find sources, particularly on YouTube, which is odd because, it's not every day that there's a forged mummy that seems to have been murdered. So let's go back to the very beginning in March 2000. It's March 2000, and someone allegedly named Amanullah Ridgey from New Jersey sent 4 Polaroid photographs of what seemed to be a mummy to Oscar Muscarella at New York's Metropolitan Museum. Along with the photographs, he included a translation of a cuneiform inscription that was visible on the mummy's gold breastplate. This supposed Ridgey, who in all likelihood doesn't really exist, at least not under that name, claimed to be acting on behalf of a Pakistani acquaintance. And on a side note, one of the strangest things to me, at least in this beginning part when the Polaroid photos are sent, is that this man claims to be acting on behalf of an acquaintance. Not a friend, not someone they know well, just an acquaintance. Which is particularly odd because I'm not sure that I would trust an acquaintance to sell a highly valuable and prized ancient artifact. So that's, for me, red flag number 1. Anyways, on top of being sold on behalf of an allegedly, again, probably not real acquaintance, Ridgey claimed that the mummy was available for purchase. The translation prepared by a cuneiform expert at a major American university identified the mummy as the daughter of the 5th century BC Persian king Xerxes. Now, Muscarella would find out that he, in fact, had not been supplied with the entirety of the expert's translation and report. And upon reading the full report, Muscarella deemed this mummy to be a fake. Because of his doubts over the iconography of carving visible on its wooden sarcophagus, he went no further into what seemed to be a very extensive and elaborate hoax. Now, that is the end of Muscarella for now in this case, but he does come back a bit later, after more things come out. Now, fast forward a few months later, in October of 2000. Pakistani police in Karachi arrested one Ali Akbar on suspicion of selling a mummy, along with another person named Wali Muhammad Reiki. It also could be pronounced Reiki. I, for the life of me, could not find a consensus on the proper pronunciation of the name, but anyways. So it is claimed that Wali Muhammad Reiki had the mummy that Ali Akbar was going to possibly sell. This mummy was later found to be the one featured in the photograph seen by Muscarella. Both men were charged with contravening Pakistan's Antiquity Act, and Reiki claimed to have received the mummy from an Iranian man named Sharif Shah Baki, who has never been located, and if I had to guess, again, similar to Reggie, doesn't actually exist. It seems like, again, this is my opinion, but it seems like Ali Akbar and Riki decided that they did not want to take the blame for selling this mummy, so they made up a man who was the one to give them the mummy, therefore it's not their fault. So I do not think that this Sharif Shah Baki exists. I think that the two of them just pulled this name out of their asses. The mummy was then taken to the National Museum in Karachi, where it was examined. Then, in October 26th, a press conference, clips of which appeared on NBC's Evening News, shows archaeologists at a university announcing that the mummy, wrapped in Egyptian style, meaning all of the organs removed, which again would later present an issue, was found to be resting in a wooden coffin carved with cuneiform writing, and images of a Zoroastrian deity was on the coffin as well. So the princess was dated to around 600 BC. While no royal burials had ever been found in the vicinity of Circe's capital, given that Egypt was part of Circe's empire, the practice of mummification was not totally out of the question, although later on, which again I'll talk about more in depth soon, upon doing CT scans of the body, it was found that literally all of the organs had been removed, including the heart. Something not done during the mummification process in ancient Egypt. The heart was believed to be the center of knowledge, so that's something that would typically stay in the body. Now, it's not totally out of the question that, again, this is before we definitively prove that this isn't a real ancient mummy, but in their defense for not realizing this sooner, it has been found. We have uncovered some Egyptian mummies with missing parts, although it's not typically internal organs that are missing. The usual reason for any sort of missing extremity on an Egyptian mummy is that there was some sort of imperfection. Often it's chalked up to being some sort of tumor or growth or something like that, so they just, take off the appendage so that it looks nicer, I suppose. But you're not going to see an internal organ. It doesn't matter if it looks kind of wonky, it's on the inside. So it is pretty odd, even if ancient Egyptians were known to just remove parts of the body with imperfections. I doubt that they would do that to the heart, because again, that's a very important part of the body in ancient Egypt. You're going to need it in the afterlife, it's believed. So the fact that there were absolutely no organs is kind of iffy for the theory that this was, in fact, mummification from Egypt, because it most certainly does not align with those practices. Back soon after these results were shared, we then got some more information about the real fake mummy. Now, the preliminary results of the examination and its inspection showed that her remains were on a mat made with a mix of wax and honey covered by a stone slab that also had written inscriptions. It gave a claim of her name being, and I am so sorry, my pronunciation is going to be so bad. Again, could not find any proper pronunciation, so I am going to try my best. It claimed that her name was Kor Elgayan or Tundalgayan. She might have been the daughter of Kurush el-Kabar, the first ruler of Persia. Alternatively, it is also suggested that the mummy could have been an Egyptian princess who married a Persian prince during Xerxes I's reign. Her body may have been preserved in the way of her cultural practices. There are different ideas about how the mummy ended up where it did. A curator at the National Museum proposed that it might have been taken from a tomb in the Hamadan region of western Iran or Quran in southwestern Pakistan. And the fact that they're not exactly sure if it came from Iran or Pakistan brings up a bunch of legal questions about who has the rights over this body, which, you know, today is not really particularly important. Obviously, the repatriation of corpses and ensuring that the ancient remains of people are returned to their communities is important, but just since this isn't a real mummy, it's less of a focus in what I'm talking about. So, while all of this legal stuff was happening, during the legal squabbling, there were subtle signs that the mummy may not be as real as the museum had let on. 2 weeks after the discovery first hit the press, Oscar Muscarella volunteered that its description sounded extremely similar to the photographs of the mummy he had been sent. In fact, it would turn out that they were the same. By November 26, it came out that smugglers had confessed to finding the mummy in the southwestern Afghan province of Nimroz on the Iranian border before taking it to Pakistan, citing the quote-unquote good evidence provided by the unidentified smugglers. It was insisted at a press conference that this corpse is property of Afghanistan and should be returned to its people. Now, after this, preliminary results from a CT scan performed on the mummy at Karachi's Aga Khan Hospital indicated that the mummy is a 20 to 21-year-old woman. Her death may have been a result of a broken spine, and radiocarbon dating of the mummy and her coffin showed that this was in fact not an ancient corpse, but a woman who had died in the recent past. An autopsy confirmed that this woman may indeed have been murdered, supposedly to provide a body for the fakers to mummify. A theory which I'm not fully sure I believe. Now, not only was the coffin new, but in some places the varnish was also found on it. It was a modern varnish and barely 20 to 30 years old. It looked like some old wooden furniture was used to make this coffin. And the reed mat laid in the coffin, and on which the mummy was enclosed in the sarcophagus, was again not ancient. This mat must have been barely a few years old. Close observation was enough to prove that it would not be accurate to refer to the mat as thousands of years old, and a technical study of the sarcophagus also proved that it could not be more than 25 years old. Scientific and technical study and close observation again said that the tools used to carve the forms and inscriptions on the coffin were, in fact, new or modern, not ancient. Fiber identification proved that the fabrics of the mummy's wraps were also modern. And the items applied to the strips of fabric covering the mummy, such as the honey, were again fresh. Now, as I said, this woman remains unidentified. She was recently buried in a graveyard for unidentified people, but there's still a lot of questions, and though a murder investigation was opened, it was never closed, nor was this case ever solved. It's not even proven that this was a murder. Specifically to how they knew that this was a fake, there are a few clarifications that I want to make and a few more details that I want to add. So one of the first things noticed was that the inscriptions on the breastplate had grammatical errors of the Persian language. So instead of the Persian form of the daughter's name, whoever had forged this inscription had used the Greek version, and x-rays indicated that the mummification had not been made following ancient Egyptian customs as stated. So, like I said, the heart had been removed along with the rest of the internal organs, where, for a genuine Egyptian mummy that would not have been done. Alongside that, the tendons of this woman should have decayed over the centuries, because even through mummification there is a certain level of breakdown that occurs. However, her tendons were still intact. So with that being said, I want to go a bit more into her death. So some articles put her age range between 20 to 25. Others say 21 to 25, but I think 20 to 25 is probably the most realistic range, because 21 is a pretty specific number to start off with. So it is thought that she died around 1996, possibly killed with a blunt instrument to the lower back/pelvic region. I have seen some claims that it was definitively proven that she was hit by a vehicle from behind. That's not necessarily true. It was never proven. It's just, again, something that's theorized because of the region where her back had been broken, as well as the type of break it was. I could not find what specific type of break, but it was like it was some sort of fracture where it could have been from a vehicle. So it's not proven that it was from a vehicle. It is just theorized that it might be. So her teeth had also been removed after death, and her hip joint, pelvis, and backbone were damaged before the body had been filled with some sort of powder. Police have investigated it as a possible murder and arrested a number of suspects, but again, the investigation has never actually concluded. So we have a couple of issues here. One, we know that this was a forgery, so we don't know who forged the mummy. We don't know who actually created the sarcophagus and all of the accoutrements that were surrounding the body. And then we also don't know who the body is or where she came from. Everything that we do have is just speculation based on physical examination, and while that is somewhat helpful, it's still, with nothing definitive, we can't positively identify this person. Now, when it comes to the possible identity of this woman, we have a few problems. So, the first thing is that the process of mummification does destroy some DNA. It makes it far harder to get DNA. So, trying to put it into some DNA database would be extremely difficult. I also am not sure the laws surrounding DNA testing in databases in Pakistan or whatever country she is currently located in, because there are some places, whereas in the US we can use databases to test the DNA of Jane Doe's, John Doe's, unidentified perpetrators of crimes. There are countries that don't allow for it or have much stricter laws surrounding it, such as the UK. So I'm not exactly sure if that would have been possible had she not have been mummified. The other problem is that, as I said, her teeth were removed. So typically, when you can't get DNA from a corpse, you would try to match dental records, but again, that's not possible due to the mummy's lack of teeth. Because she was mummified, we also cannot get an accurate description of eye color, skin color, or hair color. What we do know is that this woman was fairly, well, I say fairly, but she was pretty short. She was only 4'7", so that's 4 feet and 7 inches. And I started out saying fairly because I myself am 4 feet 8 inches tall. Which brings me to another talking point. I have heard and read a lot of people saying that because she was only 4'7", she would have stood out in a crowd and been fairly noticeable. That's, as someone who is only an inch taller than this woman would have been, I can tell you that that's not necessarily the case. The first thing to take into account is what type of shoes she wore. Even if she wasn't wearing high heels, depending on the type of shoe, like I have some sneakers that add a little bit of height just because the soles are slightly thicker. So you have to think about, would she have been 4'7" when wearing shoes, and what type of shoe she might have worn, which again, we don't know. The other thing is that despite being 4'8" myself, when I tell people that I'm 4'8", a lot of people have told me that they thought I was at least 5 foot, or that I don't seem that short. So yeah, it sounds pretty short, but depending on the way she dressed, carried herself, how good her posture was, she could have appeared to the naked eye taller. You can't look at a person, tell exactly how tall they are. You can just give an estimate. So if someone were to estimate my height as someone who's 4'8", they probably would put me more around being 5 feet tall. So that could also be the case for this woman. Just because she was 4'7" does not mean that she would have appeared to be 4'7". With shoes, clothing, even body type can make you look taller than you are. So I don't think that her height is as identifiable of a feature as people think it is. The other thing that I want to talk about is the fact that it is perpetuated that she was definitively murdered. We don't know that she was definitely murdered. And I don't say that to be like, well, no, I'm not saying that it definitely is not a murder, but I'm saying that I would not say that it also definitely is a murder. One of the main questions I had was why murder was the first thing that was jumped to, not because of her cause of death, but specifically in regards to the investigators immediately going, this woman was murdered, and she was murdered by whoever made the sarcophagus and everything else. She was murdered for the purpose of this forgery, which to me does not make a whole lot of sense in context. So, the trading of ancient antiquities is fairly profitable. Over time, museums and just generally the area of collecting artifacts has become far less about conservation and sharing the past with others, and far more about profit. So it is not particularly rare that we find forged antiquities, including mummies. But when it comes to forged mummies, the most likely place, and typically in the cases that have been solved where the people are identified, we see that these bodies were not murder victims killed for the purpose of creating a forgery. They, in fact, were bodies that were buried and body snatchers took them. So it is possible that this woman's violent death is not directly connected to the forgers, and that she just died either due to murder or was in some sort of vehicle accident, and the fracture was not done by whoever forged the sarcophagus. They just either dug her up themselves or hired another person to procure a body for them, and that person went to a cemetery and stole her body. It is also possible that maybe the forgers did not intend for someone to be killed in order to forge the mummy. Maybe they did pay someone who they assumed was some sort of body snatcher, or just figured would steal a body from a cemetery, and whoever they paid or roped into getting a body for them went out and killed this woman themselves. Maybe they accidentally hit this woman and saw the forgery that they were involved in as an opportunity to cover up manslaughter. There are a ton of different ways that this woman could have died, and not all of them mean that the forgers directly murdered her. They could have indirectly caused her murder, or she could have died and been buried. Could have been completely unrelated to the forgers, and they just happened to dig up the body of a woman who died some sort of suspicious or violent death. When it comes to identifying her, again, I think that it's going to be very difficult, and that because of the lack of identifiable features, as well as the lack of DNA and the lack of teeth to compare dental records, I don't think we're ever going to be able to identify her. If she was murdered by the forgers themselves, then clearly she was not someone who was particularly important to them. She also could not have been particularly well known in her local community, because she was not reported missing by anyone. So she was definitely, well, not definitely, but likely an outsider in the community. She was not someone who was particularly well connected in her region. If she was dug up, again, I feel that it is most likely that she was an outsider in a community, because you're not going to dig up the corpse of someone who you personally know, nor are you going to dig up the corpse of someone who is well liked by others, whose grave is regularly visited, who you might feel bad about stealing the body of. So whoever this woman was, she likely was somewhat of an outsider. Maybe she didn't have family. Maybe she did have family, but they just lived in a different area than she did. Maybe she did have friends again who were just living in a different area, or maybe she just wasn't. Maybe she was disliked by the community, or maybe she was just a fairly quiet person. Either way, it is likely that her disappearance was not noticed, or at least not noted as suspicious, and her grave was not regularly visited, because if that was the case, then it would have been clear that someone had dug up this grave and then refilled the hole. So, you know, it's very complicated. And because we don't even know that this definitively was a murder, it's very hard to figure out. I'm not saying that it's impossible and that she will never be identified, but I don't think that there is a very good likelihood that that could ever happen. So, with all of that being said, that is the end of this case. That is all of the information. As I mentioned before, information is very hard to come across. It seems that after a while, authorities just stopped releasing information, which I find extremely frustrating. It has been so long that I don't think releasing more information would do any harm. I don't think that it would cause any sort of difficulty in any investigation. And if anything, the more information they put out there, the more useful it might be in finding her identity and possibly a killer if she in fact was murdered. This is not the only case where I feel that way. There are actually other unsolved cases where, again, authorities are very quiet about it because, yes, technically it's still an open investigation, but at some point, the more information you release, the better it is, in terms of possibly being able to solve whatever crime has been committed. Anyways, I hope that you were at least mildly entertained by me talking about things. I will eventually post something else. I'm not going to say a time frame because I will not stick to it. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day or night, and that is all.